I'm Dave Lavery. I'm the Program Executive for Solar System Exploration at NASA headquarters in the Science Missions Directorate. And that's a really, really long title, but basically what it means is I'm the person at NASA headquarters who has full-time responsibility for certain of the exploration missions that we're flying right now and in development to fly around the solar system. I focus primarily on Mars exploration missions and have been doing that for the last 25 years, I guess. Anyway, Virginia Tech, class of 1982 in computer science, and then went on and did grad work in artificial intelligence later as well. Perseverance right now is still fairly new in its explorations. It's actually it's just past its 100th day on the surface and is just finishing up the instrument and rover checkout procedures. So it actually hasn't started the detailed analysis of the science results on the surface yet, but really is just validating that all the instruments survived and the rover itself survived the trip to Mars intact, unbroken, and is all functioning properly. And now that we're wrapping that process up, we're about to start the multi-year mission of exploration that Perseverance is really going to do. The biggest thing that it's going to do, its primary purpose, is to collect a bunch of samples from the surface in known locations that it will actually cache on the surface and leave behind like little trails of breadcrumbs for a later mission later on this decade to come and pick up those samples from those known locations, send them back up into Mars orbit, and then have them gathered up and returned to Earth. So we'll actually have samples of Mars from a known context back here on Earth that we can study and analyze, all in preparation for an eventual human mission. The big difference is the science package that's carried on board. It's a completely different science mission that Perseverance has from Curiosity. Curiosity's primary mission, for example, was to go and understand the environment of Mars in its ancient past and try to gather data that would confirm a theory that we had that at least one point in its past, Mars was a habitable environment as we would define it. In other words, we wanted to confirm that at some point in the Martian past, the environment was such that it was warm enough, it was wet enough, it had the right pH, and it had the right chemical signatures and chemical resources across the environment, that if, and it is a big if life could have started there, that it would have been able to survive and persist. That was building on the missions of the rovers before that, the Spirit and the Curiosity rovers from back in 2004, that were just trying to identify and prove that indeed there was a lot of water there at one time. They did that and did it very well. Knowing that there was water there, Curiosity then came and said, okay, if there was water there, can I prove that everything else would have been there necessary to support life if it had started? Curiosity then did that. Now we have the Perseverance rover that is basically building upon that question, say, okay, the first two rovers, the Spirit and Opportunity rovers, this millennia, proved there was water. The next rover, Curiosity, proved the environment was there. My job is to actually start looking to see, is there life or was there life? Can I find what we call biosignatures, small chemical signatures that are indicative of actual biology starting on the planet? And if Perseverance, and so Perseverance is what we call an astrobiology mission, and it's specifically targeted at addressing that question. To do it, to actually be able to fly in that weird environment with very, very low pressure, thin atmosphere environment on Mars, the biggest differences we had, the biggest technological challenges we had to overcome, where if you look at Ingenuity, it's basically very, very small, very, very lightweight. It only weighs just under 4 pounds. It's about 1.2 meters across in the blade diameter. It's 2 counter-rotating blades on a single powered shaft that provide the lift. But the one thing you would immediately notice versus a terrestrial helicopter, a helicopter here on Earth, typically the rotor speed is somewhere between 300 to 400 RPM. to get lift on Mars in this really thin atmosphere, these rotors have to spin really, really fast, a lot closer to 3,000 to 3,500 RPM. So this thing basically sounds like a lawnmower when it's flying because the blades are spinning so fast. The other thing is they're very, very wide in comparison to their length. So these big fat blades spinning really, really fast to generate lift that's just barely sufficient to get us up and off the ground and have stable, controlled flight. And that last little bit actually was the really important one. The thing that we found, because you have this extremely light aircraft in an extremely thin atmosphere, it was very, very difficult to control. We actually tried the same way. For example, you would have someone flying a hobby drone here on Earth with doing real-time joysticking, and we actually have a test chamber at the Jet Propulsion Lab that we can pump down to the same atmospheric pressure as that on Mars. And we stuck a test helicopter in there and tried to have a human fly it. And it was basically impossible. We had somebody who was very, very experienced in flying small UAVs. And the thing was so unstable that he just couldn't get it to fly for more than a second or two before it would come crashing down. And so we needed a control system that was very, very fast, very responsive, to be able to fly and be controlled and be stable and sustain flight. So a lot of different things that went into making this whole thing work. But the end result was it did work, and it has now flown at this point 6 times. We're getting ready for our 7th flight coming up. So one of the things that we're doing in every one of our missions is trying to understand what in the Martian environment is potentially useful for a future human mission. Are there chemical or mineral resources there on the surface in the soils or locked up in the rocks that we can process and utilize in a human mission? But also we all look at the atmosphere. Now the atmosphere of Mars is primarily carbon dioxide, but the key component there is the fact that carbon dioxide is also composed of oxygen, which is fairly easy to split out. And so one good example is on the Perseverance rover mission, there's an experiment, another technology experiment called MOXIE. And MOXIE's purpose is to demonstrate that we can have a small autonomous chemical processing package that can suck in that Martian atmosphere, condense it to a higher pressure, chemically extract the oxygen from it, and store that oxygen as pure oxygen separately for utilization by any number of different systems after that. And we've actually already run MOXIE on the surface of Mars and validated that it does indeed work. So that tells us that we have a potential oxygen resource that could be utilized by future missions, including a human mission. And once you've got the oxygen, that's important for a couple of different reasons. Number one, obviously humans want it to breathe, but that then says I can have a resource, a breathable gas that can be already put in place before a human mission even arrives. I can send these types of devices there that can just sort of sit and process the Martian atmosphere, extract the oxygen, store it, and then when the humans come along sometime later and land, they come right down beside a big tank full of O2 that can basically provide them with breathable atmosphere for their entire stay, which is wonderful. The other thing is also useful for is it's the oxidizer for rocket fuel for your return trip. So basically, this sort of opens up the possibility that we can, in effect, build a robotic gas station on Mars that can generate fuel for the return flight from Mars back to Earth so that a human mission doesn't have to carry that fuel with them, which is an enormous weight savings and therefore enormous cost savings. So things like that are happening all the time. Now, I can't tell you exactly what year it's going to happen. All of us are working towards a goal of making it happen sometime in the next decade. I firmly believe that the first human to set foot on Mars has already been born, is already out there, is studying in school right now, and who knows, it may be some of the students there at Tech. And I would love it if that were the case. And but that person, excuse me, it's certainly already likely that the first human in Mars is around and active right now. And I can't tell you what year precisely we'll send that mission, but I do know that it's coming soon. The things that have to happen, some of them have already taken place, and some of the developments we need are already known technologies, but we're still working on other ones. The biggest thing really is the space transportation system, the rocket, the spaceship that we would have that will carry that human mission from Earth to Mars and back. It's got to have a lifetime that is well beyond anything that we've built before, other than potentially the International Space Station itself. Because that every mission to Mars right now with today's technology is going to be a multi-year mission. It's going to be on the order of 3 years that it's going to take for the round trip. You're going to spend about 7 months in the cruise from Earth to Mars. Once you get there, it turns out that Earth and Mars are going to be in certain positions relative to each other where you can't immediately come back. You've actually sort of got to wait one orbit for them to swing around into position again to then spend 7 months coming back. So when you add all that together, you're talking between 2 to 3 years. So the spacecraft is going to be able to support that. And then all the subsystems associated with that, how you have a life support system that is absolutely foolproof and robust enough to take any sort of wear and tear or damage that might happen during a 3-year voyage and make it rock solid. All the food and nutrition systems, you've got to have food resources for 3 years, which again gets back to the need for water on Mars to grow more food. Breathable atmosphere, water, everything you can imagine to support a set of human beings for 3 years, you've got to have, and then backup resources on top of that. A robust communication system that has got to be able to operate and function properly to send signals from Mars back to Earth for a 3-year period without maintenance. All of those sort of things all are in development right now, and some of them we know and are refining to just make better and more robust to survive the flight, and others are brand new creations that we have to come along and think of. Started doing my first programming job when I was in 10th grade, still in high school, and learning a lot of programming. Came to Virginia Tech, got my computer science degree with an early start interest in artificial intelligence as well. Then continued on with in grad school doing that. But it was actually while I was at Tech and graduating, and I was graduating and going through the job interview process. And I'll be honest and tell you, I actually don't really remember the first interview. As one of those things where we're all going in to the interview areas in Burris Hall at the time and doing 14 different interviews before lunch. And I did a whole bunch of them, and I actually don't remember the interview that I had. But apparently I impressed somebody well enough that they called me back and said, "Hey, would you come and do a second interview? We are interested in having you talk to one of our contract sites." And I said, "Sure, that of course I'd be happy to." "Well, what's the site you want me to talk to?" And they said, "NASA headquarters." And my instant reaction was, "How much do I have to pay you to come work there?" And just sort of jumped all over it. But used that to get my foot in the door to actually start working as a contractor for NASA. And once I was there, after about 6 years, converted over from contract to full-time NASA civil servant, and working with the artificial intelligence and robotics technology program that they had at the time. And eventually I worked my way up, was able to actually run that program for 12 years. And that was the program that developed the Sojourner rover, which was the very first planetary rover that we ever sent beyond Earth and landed on Mars in 1997, that proved that a mobile platform on another planet could actually work. Number one is getting more and more capable in ways that allow real world robotic systems to be fielded and put out in the general population and utilized productively to do all sorts of different tasks. And there are things that are coming along that we're seeing now in terms of the early systems that are not necessarily the ones that we might have picked 30 years ago as being great examples, but everything from the Roomba vacuum robots that can just help me clean my floors, that's not necessarily the big application that I would have thought of 30 years ago, but now they're almost ubiquitous. I mean, they're just everywhere. And assembly line robotics, we'd all thought about on factory floors for a long time, and those certainly have happened and will continue to happen. But the idea of the autonomous biped walking around holding your packages for you as you load the car, that exist in a lot of the science fiction that I used to read. Those ones I think are still quite a ways off, and we're not going to have those for a while. But special purpose-built robots doing things like vacuuming the floors, washing windows on buildings, doing repetitive assembly tasks, things like that. Those are going to continue to become more and more common. And what's interesting is they're going to happen in some cases in ways that are so subtle that we just don't even notice that they are there, as much as we suddenly realize that's a task that I don't have to do anymore, that this automated mechanism that I may or may not call a robot is handling for me. So I was lucky enough while I was a student there at Tech. My advisor was George Gorsline, and I was able to tap into his head several different times during my undergraduate career and learn a lot of different things from him, both in terms of my in-class activities. He was actually my very first. Now that I think about it, he was my very first computer science professor at Tech when I came there as a student. And so I took several of his classes and learned a lot there, obviously, as well. But the things that I got from him in some other sessions outside the classroom, I think were probably the most valuable. The first one was, he was very clear about making sure that we all understood, don't stovepipe yourself. Yeah, you may be here because you want to get a computer science degree, and you're going to do a certain number of computer science classes and learn about that. But make sure you learn about as many different broad topic areas in other disciplines as you possibly can, because you have absolutely no idea right now how useful that stuff is all going to be later on in your career. So even if you do end up with a computer science career, for me, for example, I took a bunch of microcomputing interfacing courses in the chemistry department at the time, because it was a series of courses on how to interface lab instruments with a microprocessor. And I took all of those courses, and they were amazing. And I've pulled that knowledge back later on in my career when I never would have guessed that I needed a bunch of chemistry courses for my computer science career. But those were the ones that I needed. And that one you could sort of understand, but the other chemistry courses that I took, like scientific instrument glass blowing, and I took 3 glass blowing classes, and why not was sort of my thought at the time. But it turned out that knowledge that I got from my glassworking classes came back to be enormously useful later on in my career when I was working on scientific instruments, and we were very concerned about the chemical content and structure and impurities inside lensing systems associated with science instruments. And it's things like that are really hard to predict about how you're going to use that information. But every single class I took outside of my major came to be very, very useful later on. So the more diversity you can have in what you're studying while you're there, the better off you're going to be. And that stuff will really matter 10, 20, 30 years from now. The one other thing is, for every technical degree or technical major student out there, that I would urge every single one of them is take as many English and writing classes as you possibly can, because every single engineering and science student underestimates how much they're going to be writing during their career, whether it's writing proposals for your next piece of work, writing reports of what you've done already, and trying to communicate the results. If you can't communicate clearly with a written word, you're going to be in trouble. And so do that as much as you possibly can.